My name is Jason. I'm 41 years old, and I work nights as a security guard in downtown Chicago. The city after dark has a way of showing you its forgotten corners, and I've learned to notice things most people would rather ignore. That's why, cutting through Millennium Park after my shift, I slowed down when I saw a crumpled shape lying under a bench. At first, I thought it was just an old sweatshirt, damp with evening dew, abandoned like so many things are in this city. But then it moved. I stopped dead, my breath tight in my chest. A small paw slipped out from the folds of fabric, white but stained and gray with dirt. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw him. A puppy. No more than 3 months old, a French Bulldog, his white coat patched with black but buried beneath filth and grit. His little ribs stuck out with every shallow breath, each one sharp and fragile, as if the effort of staying alive had already drained him of everything he had left. He was curled into himself, so small against the cold stone, as if the world had pressed him down and he was trying to vanish inside his own body. The wind rattled through the bare trees, scattering leaves across the path, but I barely heard it. All I could hear was his breathing, thin, rasping, uncertain. I crouched, the chill of the pavement creeping into my knees, and leaned closer. His eyes opened at the sound. They weren't the bright, playful eyes a puppy should have. They were hollow, weary, almost lifeless, holding just enough to notice me and nothing more. I held out my hand, not touching, just hovering in the air, afraid he would vanish if I dared too much. His body trembled, not in fear but in weakness, a tiny rhythm that said he was still fighting, even if it was only barely. The city roared around us, the distant train, the honk of traffic, the buzz of neon, but in that moment, everything else disappeared. It was just me and him, in the silence between breaths. "I see you," I whispered, my voice breaking in the cold night air. "Please, hang on." I stayed there for what felt like forever, my hand suspended above him, the city rushing past us like we weren't even there. Finally, I lowered my palm onto the fabric near his tiny body. He didn't flinch, didn't snap, didn't even try to crawl away. That stillness broke something in me. It wasn't trust, it was exhaustion, the kind of surrender that only comes when you've already run out of choices. I slid the sweatshirt aside and carefully lifted him out. He was lighter than I expected, terrifyingly so, his bones pressing into my hands through that filthy, matted coat. I could feel his ribs shift with every shallow breath. His fur carried the sour smell of damp stone and days without care, a stench that clung to my jacket as if it wanted me to remember how close he was to being lost. His head lolled against my wrist, his ears twitching once at the sound of a car horn echoing through the streets beyond the park. His eyes opened just a slit, and for the first time I saw them clearly under the dim light. They were glassy, but somewhere inside that haze was a flicker, the faintest spark of life clinging on. I whispered, more to steady myself than him, "I've got you now. You're not alone." I stood and cradled him against my chest, and he barely moved, only a faint shiver running through his fragile body. The wind blew colder off the lake, tugging at my coat, and I pressed him closer, trying to shield him from it. He was so small, he almost disappeared in my arms, a forgotten scrap of life in the middle of one of the loudest cities in the world. Every step I took out of that park felt like a decision, heavy and absolute. I didn't know if he'd survive the night, if he'd even make it through the ride home. But I knew I couldn't set him back down. He had breathed in my arms, his heart had beaten under my hands, and that was enough to bind me to him. I whispered again, softer this time, "Stay with me, little one. Just stay." The city seemed louder as I carried him out of the park, like Chicago itself was trying to remind me how indifferent it could be. The clatter of the L overhead, the bass of a passing car stereo, the endless rush of people moving toward warm bars and bright lights, all of it washed over me as I clutched that fragile body to my chest. He felt like nothing in my arms, no weight at all, and that terrified me more than anything. A puppy should be solid, squirming, full of energy. This one was barely here. I ducked into the glow of a street lamp and finally saw his face clearly. His fur, what should have been white with proud black patches, was streaked with mud and grease, sticking together in clumps that made him look smaller still. His nose was dry, cracked at the edges, and when his tongue flicked out, it was slow, almost uncertain, as if even that tiny gesture cost him something. I whispered his reality under my breath, like saying it aloud made it harder to deny. 3 months old, and already fighting to stay alive. I could see people passing by, glancing at me for half a second before moving on. To them, I probably looked like just another tired man clutching a stray, another story they didn't want to involve themselves in. But for me, each step was a question. Would his breathing stop before I found help? Would he slip away in my arms, another small life I was too late to save? My chest tightened every time his shivering paused, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting, listening. And then a weak tremor would ripple through his body again, and I'd let mine out in shaky relief. I pushed open the door of a late-night corner shop, desperate for water, anything. The man behind the counter looked up, his face softening when he saw what I carried. He didn't ask questions, just handed me a plastic cup and pointed to the small sink in the back. I dipped my fingers into the water and brought them to the puppy's mouth. At first, nothing. Then, slowly, his tiny tongue moved, lapping weakly at the drops. It was messy, pitiful, but it was something. It was life insisting it wasn't finished. I felt my throat close, and I whispered to him like a promise. "That's it. Don't give up on me. I won't give up on you." I sat on the curb just outside the shop, the paper cup of water balanced in one hand, the puppy pressed against my chest with the other. The city swirled around us. Headlights cutting across the street, the rumble of buses pulling up to stops. People wrapped in coats hurrying by with eyes fixed on their own destinations. None of them stopped. None of them noticed the fragile life shaking in my arms. For a moment, I felt like we were invisible, tucked into the cracks of Chicago where no one bothers to look. I tried again with the water, dipping my fingers and letting drops fall onto his muzzle. His tongue flicked out, hesitant but hungry, catching what little he could. I tilted the cup and brushed it near his mouth, and suddenly there was urgency in the way he licked at it, as if he'd remembered what it was to need, to want. A part of me broke open at the sight. The smallest act, just drinking, felt like a victory in a battle that wasn't supposed to be ours to fight on a cold night in this city. His body was trembling less now, but I couldn't tell if that was strength or the comfort of being held against my jacket. I kept running my palm gently over his bony back, feeling each ridge of his spine. He didn't shy away from my touch. He leaned into it, so faintly I almost thought I imagined it, but enough to know he wasn't completely gone. A man passing by muttered something about another stray, his voice clipped and careless, and it stung in a way I didn't expect. I wanted to shout that this wasn't just a stray. This was a 3-month-old French Bulldog puppy who had been left to die under a park bench, who still had a chance if someone just cared enough. Instead, I whispered to the pup, steady and low, "You're not just another stray. Not to me." The lights of the city blurred at the edges of my vision as I realized I had to make a choice. Standing there with water wasn't enough. He needed warmth, food, someone who knew more than I did. A vet, maybe. At the very least, somewhere safe to make it through the night. I pulled him closer, tucking his small head under my chin, and rose to my feet. His breath fluttered against my neck, weak but steady. Every step toward home felt heavier, but also certain. I didn't know if he would survive the night, but I knew I couldn't let him go back to being just a bundle on a cold stone path. I pressed my lips close to his ear and whispered into the dark, "We're going together now, one way or another." The night had deepened by the time I reached my apartment. The kind of cold that seeps through every crack in the buildings, rolling off Lake Michigan in waves that bite straight to the bone. I carried him close, shielding him from the wind with my coat, whispering over and over like a prayer, as if my words could hold him here. Almost there. Just a little longer. Each block felt longer than the last, every sound of his uneven breathing gnawing at me, reminding me how close I was to losing him. When I pushed open the door to my place, the warmth hit us both at once. The radiator clanked to life with its usual complaints, but tonight that sound felt like a promise of safety. I laid him gently on an old fleece blanket I spread across the couch. The sight nearly undid me. His body so small against the fabric, his fur filthy and dull, every rib standing out as though his skin was too thin to hold him together. He tried to curl into himself, shivering even in the warmth, and I couldn't stop the tightness in my chest. I filled a small bowl with water and another with a bit of softened food I had left from when my neighbor's dogs stayed with me. He didn't rush to them. He didn't even look at them. For a moment, dread twisted in my gut. Then I dipped my fingers into the water again, touched it to his muzzle, and slowly, like before, he licked. This time, though, he kept going. Small, weak laps, but steady. My heart swelled with every one. When I slid the bowl closer, he leaned forward and drank, messy and desperate. Food was harder. His teeth worked clumsily, as if the idea of chewing was almost forgotten. But he tried. The sound of him eating, faint and broken though it was, felt like the loudest, most beautiful thing I'd heard in weeks. I sat on the floor beside him, watching, the city outside humming through the window glass. I'd seen a lot in this job, in this city. Broken things, dangerous things, lives discarded. But never had I felt the weight of responsibility like this. A life was cradled in my living room, clinging to survival by threads. And for some reason, fate had put him in my hands. When he finally slumped against the blanket, too tired to keep going, I tucked another layer around him. His breathing was shallow, but steadier now, as if the food and water had lit a small fire inside him. I leaned close, my voice barely above a whisper. You made it here. That's the first step. Tomorrow, we fight again. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every sound he made pulled me back from the edge of rest, the faint whimper that escaped when he shifted, the uneven rattle in his chest, the silence that stretched too long before the next breath finally came. I sat in the dim light of the living room, my coffee cooling on the table untouched, eyes fixed on that tiny shape curled on the blanket. Outside, Chicago carried on with its restless hum, sirens rising and falling in the distance, the groan of the elevated train cutting through the night air, the occasional burst of laughter from people stumbling home. But in here, everything narrowed to the fragile rhythm of one small puppy's survival. At some point he stirred, his head lifting weakly, as though the world was suddenly too heavy to hold up. I slid down from the chair and crouched beside him, offering my hand. His eyes met mine, dark and tired, but something flickered there. Recognition, maybe, or just the awareness that he wasn't alone anymore. He pushed his nose into my palm, faintly, shakily, but he did it. And I swear, in that moment, I felt the weight of his trust settle into me, like a responsibility I'd never asked for, but could never refuse. I knew I couldn't do this alone. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The first light broke pale and gray over the skyline, seeping through the blinds, and I wrapped him gently in the blanket. He barely resisted, too weak for protest. His small body pressed against my chest as I carried him down the stairs. The air outside was sharp, cutting through my coat, but he was warm against me, trembling less now than before. The walk to the nearest vet felt endless, every block testing my resolve. I kept looking down at him, terrified I'd miss the moment if he slipped away. His breath fluttered, shallow but there, and with every inhale I whispered back to him, "You're still here." That's all we need. When I pushed open the clinic door, the smell of antiseptic and the sudden brightness almost overwhelmed me. The receptionist's eyes widened when she saw what I carried. I didn't need to explain much, just the way I held him, the look on my face. A vet tech appeared almost instantly, ushering me toward the back. My hands tightened around him as if letting go would undo everything we'd survived through the night. I bent close to his ear as they reached for him, my voice breaking against the weight of the moment. "Stay with me. Just a little longer. Please." They led me into a small exam room, the kind that smelled faintly of bleach and dog treats, sterile and yet strangely hopeful. I laid him down on the metal table, and for a moment I thought he might slip away right there, swallowed up by the cold surface. His legs folded beneath him, his head sagged to the side, and the sight clawed at my chest. I wanted to scoop him back into my arms, but the vet was already there, gentle yet firm, checking his tiny chest with a stethoscope. I stood frozen in the corner, hands clenched, every muscle in me tense as I watched. The vet's brow furrowed, her movements calm but urgent. She murmured to the tech, words like dehydration, underweight, pneumonia. Each one landed like a stone in my stomach. She lifted her head briefly, catching my eyes. "He's critical, but he's fighting. We'll need to give him fluids, antibiotics, warmth. Tonight is the turning point." I nodded, though my throat felt sealed shut. Fighting. That word lit something inside me. He hadn't given up, not in the park, not in my arms, not through the long night in my apartment. He was still here, still trying. The tech slid a tiny IV into his fragile leg, and I winced as if it were my own skin. His body jerked slightly at the needle, then stilled, too weak for much else. The monitor beeped steadily, a sound that wrapped around me like a lifeline. Every beep was proof that he hadn't let go. I reached out, brushing my fingers along his dirty fur, careful not to disturb the lines and tubes. His skin was still rough beneath the grime, but warm now, warmed by something more than my coat, by the fight inside him, by the help he'd finally been given. He didn't pull away from my touch. Instead, his eyes cracked open, heavy and glazed, and for the first time I saw him look at me not with fear, but with something else. A question. A faint, flickering connection. "I'm here," I whispered, leaning close so only he could hear. "You don't have to do this alone anymore." The vet adjusted the drip, her voice steady but softer now. "If he makes it through tonight, he's got a chance." I swallowed hard, staring down at him, at this tiny French Bulldog who had no reason to still be breathing but somehow was. The world outside could roar and spin all it wanted, but in that room, time hung on the fragile thread of one puppy's will to survive. I closed my eyes for a moment, let out a trembling breath, and pressed my hand gently against his side. His ribs rose and fell beneath my palm, steady now with the machine's help, the only words I could manage. "You fight, I'll fight. That's the deal." I came back the next morning with barely any sleep, my chest tight with dread. The city outside the clinic was waking up, honking horns, the smell of coffee drifting from the corner cafe, the steel-gray sky pressing down on the skyline. But all I cared about was what I would find behind that door. The vet led me into the same exam room, and for a second I didn't breathe. Then I saw him. He was still curled on the table, wrapped in a soft towel this time, instead of lying bare on cold metal. The IV was still in his tiny leg, but his chest rose more steadily now, each breath deeper than the night before. And when I stepped closer, his head lifted. Not much, just enough that his dark eyes found mine. Something inside me broke and mended all at once. He remembered me. The vet's voice was gentler today. "He made it through the night. He's still weak, but he's stronger than we thought." Stronger than we thought. I clung to those words like rope in a storm. I sat beside him, careful not to jostle the lines, and laid my hand along his back. His fur was still filthy, clumped with dried dirt, but the warmth beneath it was undeniable. He blinked slowly, then shifted, pressing his small head against my fingers. That simple act, leaning in, felt monumental. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving, he was reaching. The vet gave me a damp cloth and nodded, and I began to clean him gently. At first, the grime came off in streaks, revealing patches of fur that gleamed faintly white beneath. His black markings stood out more sharply now, like they'd been hidden under weeks of neglect. He squirmed a little at the touch, weak but alive, and I couldn't stop the laugh that cracked through my exhaustion. It was the first sound of joy I'd made in days. "You're in there," I whispered as I wiped carefully around his ears, his paws. "I can see you now." By the time I finished, he looked less like a ghost and more like a puppy again, thin, fragile, still fighting, but unmistakably himself. His eyes stayed on me, softer now, and when I paused, his tongue flicked out clumsily, brushing my hand. It wasn't much, just a puppy's instinctive gesture, but it was more than I dared hope for. I sat back, tears blurring the sterile white of the room, and let myself believe for the first time that he might really make it. That this little life I'd stumbled upon under a bench in Millennium Park wasn't just surviving anymore. He was beginning to come back. And I realized, with a sudden certainty that shook me, that he wasn't just some stray I'd found. He was mine. The first time I walked into the clinic without that knot of fear in my stomach, the city outside felt different. The wind was still cold, the train still screeched overhead, but there was a strange lightness to it all, as if Chicago itself had softened just enough to let us breathe. When I stepped into the exam room, he was already sitting up on his towel, thin but upright, his head cocked slightly as though he'd been waiting. His fur was still patchy where the dirt had been hardest to scrub out, but most of the grime was gone now. The white of his coat showed like new snow, the black patches vivid against it. He looked smaller without all the filth, his ribs still visible but not as sharp, the curve of his back less desperate. And when he saw me, his eyes lit. Not much, but enough. That flicker of life I'd clung to had turned into something steadier, like a pilot light catching hold. I crouched down in front of the table, resting my arms on the edge, and for the first time he moved toward me without coaxing. His paws slid across the towel, clumsy but determined, until his nose bumped against my fingers. He sniffed, then pressed his head against my palm. The warmth of him, the simple weight of that gesture, made the room tilt. The vet smiled faintly from the corner. He's turning a corner, eating more on his own now, drinking well. You've done a lot for him. I shook my head, eyes still on him. He's done it for himself. I just caught him before it was too late. I lifted him carefully into my arms. He fit there differently now. Less like something fragile about to break, more like a small animal rediscovering what it meant to be held. His body trembled with excitement rather than weakness. The sound he made against my chest was almost a sigh, but I swore I felt the faintest vibration of a wagging tail brush against my arm. Out the window, the skyline glinted under a thin winter sun, and I remembered the first night. The crumpled shape under the bench, the cold stone, the way his eyes had seemed already gone. I held him closer, feeling his heartbeat strong against mine, and whispered the name that had been sitting on my tongue for days, waiting for the right moment to surface. Leo, I said softly, my lips close to his ear. Your name is Leo. He shifted in my arms at the sound. A tiny movement that felt like an answer. I carried him out of the clinic that day, with the city stretching wide around us, Chicago alive in every direction. The lake wind tugged at my coat, the chorus of horns and trains roared, and for once I didn't feel the weight of it pressing me down. Because in my arms was a little French Bulldog who had been nothing more than a trembling shadow under a park bench not long ago, and now he was lifting his head to take in the world. Leo. His name fit him in ways I hadn't expected. Small as he was, thin and fragile still, there was something lion-hearted in the way he'd fought to stay here. I could feel it in the steady beat of his chest against mine, in the way his eyes no longer looked through me, but into me, alive and certain. At home, he stepped off the couch for the first time without wobbling sideways. His paws clicked against the hardwood as he crossed the room, unsteady but determined, like each step was a declaration. I crouched low, holding my breath as he came toward me, and when he reached my knees, he lifted his head, his tail wagging, truly wagging for the first time. The sight cracked me open. That small rhythm of joy, that simple movement, carried more meaning than 1,000 words. I scooped him up, and he licked my chin clumsily, the kind of kiss only a puppy can give, messy and full of need. His fur, still thin in places, brushed warm against my cheek. The grime and stink of the city were gone now, replaced by the soft smell of soap, of new beginnings. Through the window, the skyline rose in steel and glass, the same city that had almost taken him away. But here, in my arms, it was no longer a place of indifference. It was where he'd been found, where he'd been named, where he'd come back to life. As night settled over Chicago, Leo curled against me on the couch, his breathing slow and even, no longer fragile but peaceful. I rested my hand along his back, feeling the steady rise and fall, and let the quiet fill the room. I thought of the first time I saw him, when I mistook him for trash, when I wasn't sure he'd take another breath. And now here he was, a life remade, a bond written into both of us. I whispered into the stillness, not needing him to understand the words, only the feeling. You're safe now, Leo. You're home.